Hi guys, welcome to your first research methods homework. The idea here is that you're going to be introduced to research methods through this video. You're going to complete the worksheet alongside this video, and you're going to do a quick quiz at the end to check that you understand it all. And that's the way kind of each of these homeworks will work, allowing us to get through a topic at home rather than having to do it in the lesson. And giving us some time to work on other things. So what we're doing to start with is I'm just going to introduce you to research methods and some of the key terms involved in research. This is all about how sociologists will gather evidence to back up their theories and their arguments. There's a number of key terms that we need to look at and a few different aspects to how the research is completed. The main kind of area that we're going to look at over the weeks is each individual method of the kind of main ones and looking at the strengths and weaknesses of each. So our first key term that we have here is the difference between primary data and secondary data, and students sometimes find this confusing. Primary data is first-hand data that you actually gather yourself as the researcher. So for example, a questionnaire that you've written, you've kind of sent out to lots of different people, they filled them out and sent them back, and then you analyze. That's primary data. You created it, you've gone and done the thing to gather the data, to create the data. Secondary data, on the other hand, is data that's created by someone else. And then as a researcher, you can use it and analyze it in some way to try and make some conclusions. So there's lots of different forms this can take. You know, the government put together lots of different statistics on prisons and schools and various other things. That's data that's created by someone else. Alternatively, it can be things like people's diaries. When someone writes a diary, they might not be intending it for sociological use, but we can use their diary, we can analyze their diary to see what's going on at the time. For example, if we got a load of diary entries about 9/11, the terror attacks, we'd be able to try and understand what was going on at that time. We haven't written the diaries, we haven't got people to write the diaries, the data already exists, it's already been created by someone else, but then we can use it, and that's secondary data. Now, some people get confused. They think secondary data is sociological research that's already been done. Like if somebody's already done some research and put together a conclusion and then you analyze that. That technically, I guess, would be secondary data, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about stuff that hasn't really been analyzed yet. Stuff that people haven't looked at and used in research yet. So what you need to do is you need to get those definitions and examples down on the worksheet. So pause the video now and go ahead and fill that out. Okay, a couple more key terms. Another thing that you need to know is the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. Basically, quantitative data, the root word there is quantity, which is all about numbers. It's all about how much. So quantitative data is data that is in numerical form. It's numbers. It's easily put into statistics. So again, if I send out a questionnaire about ice creams and what the best ice cream flavor is, if I get 18 out of 20 people responding in a certain way, that's a quantitative data. I can turn that into a statistic easily. The opposite is qualitative data. This is data that's non-numerical. It's word form. And it's usually in far more depth. There's a lot more detail with qualitative data. It's usually around people's feelings and opinions as well. So an example might be, if I'm interviewing people about their home life and one of the participants is, talking in detail about how she's kind of frustrated and angry with her partner because he doesn't help around the house and he doesn't give her the attention that she deserves. If she's expressing that, in words, in depth, I can't really turn that into statistics. It'd be very difficult to put that into a number. That's qualitative data. So quantitative and qualitative. Again, get those descriptions or definitions and examples written down on the worksheet. Now, sampling's a slightly different thing. The key terms we talked about so far are just general key terms that you'll come across a lot during your research methods work. Sampling is specific to how do we actually go about and get the people that we want to use in our research. So there's such a thing as a survey population. This is the group of people who my research is about. If I'm researching, achievement in education, my research is about students. My survey population is students. If I'm researching patterns of crime, then I'd be looking at pretty much everybody. My survey population there would be pretty much the entire society. But obviously I can't research the entire society, and I can't research every student. That just wouldn't be possible. So from the survey population, what we do is we take a smaller group, and that's called a sample, and that's when you do your sampling. Now there's different ways of getting your sample. There's different ways of picking the people that are going to be in your research, and these are called sampling methods. And you need to know some examples of these sampling methods, and you need to know some of the kind of strengths and weaknesses about them. So that's what we're going to look at now. So the first sampling method we're going to look at is one called a random sample. So this is where I've got a list of all the people that in my survey population, all the people that my research is kind of about, and I randomly select a smaller group from that, as a certain number. Let's say there's 10,000 people in my survey population. I randomly select 200 or something like that, and those will become my sample. And in order for it to be random, you could use pick the names out of a hat, or you can get computer programs that will kind of randomly select a set number of names or people out of the larger group. Now, the strength of that is that it's kind of quick and simple and easy. That's not that difficult to do, and you should end up with a reasonable range of different people involved. What we call an unbiased or representative sample. The problem is, though, you can't guarantee that. So the weakness is you can't guarantee that you'll get a representative sample. You could end up with, if I randomly selected 10 people out of our class, they could all end up being the same gender. They could all end up being girls, for example. And that way I'm not getting a particularly representative view. I'm getting a biased view. So there's a problem there with random sampling, is you can't guarantee an unbiased or representative sample. A stratified random sample kind of fixes that. A stratified random sample is where you work out for your survey population all the different types of people involved, all the different groups, whether that's age or gender or ethnicity or class, all these different ways of kind of dividing people into groups. You split them all up and you work out proportions. So there's a bit of maths involved. You work out proportions. Let's say I'm doing research on 100 people. My survey population is 100 people, and 50 of those people are middle-aged, 25 of those people are like 0 to 25, and the other 25 of those people are like 70 plus. If I wanted a sample of 10 people, I'd need to try and get the same proportions or ratios. I'd need to try and get half of them would need to be the middle-aged ones, a quarter of them would need to be the old, and a quarter of them would need to be the young, to make sure that the ratios, the proportions are right. Then I'd randomly select 5 middle-aged people from all the middle-aged people, and I'd randomly select 3 young people from all the young people, and that way I get a more proportional, more representative sample. So really, stratified random sampling, the strength of it is it's the most representative out of all the methods. All the sampling methods. The weakness of it, though, is that it's a lot more complicated, and that takes a lot more time. It's not always perfect. You can't always get the perfect proportions, so it's a bit more challenging to actually go about and do. It adds time to your research and effort, and often it adds cost to your research. If things take longer, that can add costs as well. So it's most representative, but it's the least practical. Another method that people use is something called snowball sampling. And this is where you kind of find one person, you get connected to one person who's happy to be a part of your research. And they might know another person. and that person might know 2 other people. And so you kind of get connected from one to another. It's called snowball because if you think of a snowball rolling down a hill, it kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger the further it goes. And that's the idea with snowball sampling. The more people that you kind of get referred to, the more people they might know. The example of when you'd use something like this is when you're researching certain topics. So like drug addiction might be a good example here. There's not going to be many people who are going to happily come and say, yeah, I'll do some research about drug addiction. I'll sign up to a list as a drug addict, or or crime, for example. You're not going to get many criminal gangs signing up to be involved in research. If you know one person, if you happen to have a connection with one person, you're more likely that they can kind of connect you with other people in that world, in those topics. So the big strength of that is it might well be the only way that you can actually carry out research for certain areas, certain people, certain topics. It might be the only way really that you can get involved and do some research on a violent gang, for example. But the big problem with it is because all the people are connected, because they know each other, chances are they're quite similar people. For example, me myself, I have 2 social networks, my family, who have all had the same kind of background as me, same kind of upbringing, same kind of values, and my colleagues. Obviously I don't have any friends, my colleagues who are all teachers. So what we've got there are sets of people who are actually quite similar to me, are going to give the same kind of answers or responses in research. So that would be unrepresentative, and that's the weakness of snowball sampling. The final one I'm going to talk about is volunteer sampling. Now, a volunteer sample is exactly what it sounds like. People basically volunteer. You can put an advert out on social media, you can stick up a poster, you can send emails out, depending on where you are and what you're researching, you basically set up an advert and people will volunteer for it. Big strength, a bit like random sample, this is really quick, really easy to do. And you're more likely to get more people than, for example, a snowball, doing the snowball method. You could get a reasonable amount of people to do your research in a fairly short, easy way of getting it. The problem, though, is a lot like snowball sample, is you might end up with all the same kinds of people. You've got to think about who are the people who are going to be happy to volunteer for this kind of thing. Most likely they're going to be people that don't work that often, so they've got a lot of free time, like the retired, the elderly. There are also going to be certain personalities, people who are more likely to be extroverted than introverted, are going to take part in volunteer samples, going to be that outgoing. So again, you could end up with an unrepresentative or biased sample. And that's the strength and weakness of those different methods. Now you could get a question, an exam question, on 2 strengths or weaknesses or 2 different methods, and you'd have to be able to say what the method is and explain the strengths and weaknesses and kind of evaluate them together. So make sure you are writing down the strengths and weaknesses of each of those from what I've said on your worksheet, please. Now we're getting to perhaps stuff that you're going to be using more often. I mean, we're going to be talking about the content that's on this slide quite a lot. When you go through any of the research methods questions, whether it's a 10 or 20 mark question, you're going to need to use this acronym PERVERT. And the main reason that I'm doing these lessons as a video and not in person is because every time I write PERVERT on the board, someone takes a photo of me standing next to it and then puts it on social media. So I'm avoiding that problem by putting it on the slide here, and we're going to go through it online. PERVERT stands for all the different factors involved in research, all the different factors that will apply to the different research methods. So for example, the P stands for practical. There are practical factors going on. I'm going to go through each of these factors and what kind of things are going to be involved, so that when we start looking at the methods next week, you'll be able to think about the strengths and weaknesses of that method to do with PERVERT. And this is basically how you're going to write your essays as well. This is how you're going to answer questions. You're going to talk about these different types of factors and issues. Firstly then is practical factors. And that's things basically to do with how easy or difficult it is to actually physically do the method, do the research. The big three that you're talking about here are how long it takes, how much money it costs, and how easy it is to gain access to the people that you're trying to research. So if it takes a long time, if it's really expensive, if it's really difficult to kind of gain access to the people that you want to research, then it's practically quite a weak method. Some methods are very quick, very cheap, and very easy to gain access to the people you want. Therefore, practically, they're a strong method. The next one is ethical factors. And if you do psychology, you're probably aware of these already. Ethics are to do with what's kind of morally acceptable, what's morally right and wrong. So if I'm doing research and I'm torturing people in that research, or I'm affecting their life chances, if I screw up their entire education or something like that, that's really unethical. It's immoral. That was the wrong thing to do. And whenever you do sociological research, you have to submit like a proposal to an ethics board. You have to tell a group of people, professionals, what you're going to do and how you're going to deal with any potential ethical issues. And there's a whole range of different things. So one is informed consent. The person who's doing the research, they need to know exactly what's going to go in. Very similarly, there's an issue of deception. You shouldn't really be lying to your participants about what you're doing. A big one would be protection from harm. They shouldn't come out of the research in a worse state, either mentally or emotionally or physically, than when they started the research. Another one is the right to withdraw. You've got to make it clear that at any point they can stop, they can quit, they can take all of their data, and you can't use their data in the research. So you've got to make that clear as well. A couple others, you've got confidentiality or anonymity, meaning if I've got personal information about someone or any kind of information about a participant, you can't kind of share that. It can't be obvious who your research was done on. And then you've got sensitivity. This links to the protection from harm. A lot of the time, sociological research is dealing with sensitive issues. For example, like domestic abuse. At that point, you've got to be very careful about how you do it so that you don't cause harm to people and that you're kind of helping them and supporting them. So lots of different ethical issues, and sometimes you might lie. You might deceive, you might not give informed consent in order to get better results. So there's trade-off a lot of the time with some of the ethical things, but I'll make that clearer as we look at the different methods. The next two, reliability and validity, people muddle up. It's the single biggest mistake that students make. Reliable data is all about how easy it is to replicate, how easy it is to do the research again, someone else do the research again in the exact same way that it was originally done. Now, you do it with different people, but the exact same process. If it's really difficult to replicate, you would say it's low in reliability. If it's really easy to do the exact same thing in the exact same way, in the exact same kind of time frame, then you'd say it's kind of high in reliability. But a lot of students see the word reliable and they think kind of trustworthy or true, and that's not what that means in this context. So make sure you make a big, clear note of that, highlight that. It's all about how easy it is to replicate, to repeat the research. Validity is all about how accurate and true it is. So if I'm interviewing someone and they lie, that doesn't affect reliability, that affects validity. But it's more than just getting the truth. It's also about getting like the whole truth. It's getting the full picture, getting the complete picture. They might not be lying, but they might only be telling half the story, in which case it's lower in validity. If I get the whole truth, if I get all the detail, all the depth, and it's accurate and it's true, then it's very high in validity. The second E is there to remind you that when you're writing a research methods essay, it's good to use examples. So when we go through each of the methods, I'll give you an example of research that was done using that method to support one of the other points. So I'll give you an example of how they did it in a practical way, or how they did it and it was unethical, etc., etc. And you need to use those to kind of back up and support your argument, the point that you're making in your essay. And it also helps to spell the word pervert, which is a memorable acronym. Last couple, what we've got is representativeness. Now this is where your kind of sampling issues and knowledge comes in. Representativeness is about how similar your sample is to your survey population. How close that is, and can we then generalize the results to that survey population, that wider population? Can we actually apply the results to the wider society? And if we can't do that, then the research isn't that useful. So it's all about things like sample size and whether the sample's biased, whether you've got the same kind of people in it, or whether it is actually representative of the people you're researching. Then you've got the final one, which is theoretical issues. Now, I'm going to do an entire kind of lesson on this because it's really important and it's something that's quite difficult to wrap your head around. But for now, all I'm going to say is that it's about the perspective, it's about the way that the actual researcher, the sociologist, views society. And you generally fall into one of two groups as a sociologist. You fall into either a positivist or an interpretivist. Like I said, I'm going to teach you a lot more about that later, and you'll be able to go back and apply that to the different methods once I've done that in a bit more detail. It's difficult to wrap your head around, which is why I'm going to take an entire lesson to do it. Now, hopefully you've got all of that sorted. You've filled out the worksheet to go along with this. You understand all of the key terms, all the different things I've talked about, and that's all made sense. Just to double check that you have understood it, I'd want you to complete the quiz. The URL link is in your team's assignment. It's the second link underneath the link for the video. Click on that, it'll take you to Microsoft Forms. You can answer the questions, it'll give you a score there and then. I'll be able to then see that score, and it's another way for me to know that you've done the homework and you've done it well and you understand it. So you need to make sure you bring your worksheet to the lesson and that you've done the quiz, and that's how I know your homework is complete. And just as a little bonus content, what I'm going to do each week is tell you a little story, a part of how I met my wife. So I'll tell you a little bit from today. What happened was I first met her in a library, and she walked in, and because it's a library, I had to whisper. I said, "Are you an overdue book?" And she said, "What? What do you mean?" I said, "Are you an overdue book?" She goes, "No." I said, "Because you've got fine written all over you." And that was what I first said to my wife when I met her in the library. Okay, thanks guys, see you in lesson.